In 1972, Apollo 17, the final mission to our nearest neighbor, left the moon. We have yet to return. By then, Congress had decided that, having won the space race, it was no longer worth the cost to continue lunar operations. But there was Apollo hardware left over, namely 2 Saturn V's, 4 Saturn 1B boosters, command service modules, and 2 lunar modules. One of the Saturn 1Bs would be used to launch the Apollo-Soyuz command module in 1975, but one of the Saturn V S-4B upper stages would become America's first space station, Skylab.
The primary purpose of the first moon trip will be to test the methods and equipment to be used on later voyages into deep space.
In the 1950s, famous rocket engineer Wernher von Braun participated in the publishing of a series of influential articles in Collier's magazine titled "Man Will Conquer Space Soon." In them, and on a famous television appearance, von Braun envisioned a large circular station 250 feet in diameter that would rotate to generate artificial gravity and require a fleet of space vehicles for construction in orbit. He envisioned 80 astronauts, including astronomers operating a telescope, meteorologists to forecast the weather, and soldiers to conduct surveillance work. The station would also be the first stop for Moon and Mars missions. But as satellite technology increased, such a large station was no longer necessary. When the Apollo program would send humans to the moon, it didn't need in-orbit assembly. The Soviet Union, having lost the moon, focused on space stations and showed that a smaller station that a single rocket could launch was not only possible, but more efficient. When the National Aeronautical and Space Association was founded, the idea of a station was the central focus of planners. A number of NASA centers studied various space station designs in the early 1960s. Some of the first studies used Gemini as a basis, launching on a Titan II-C called the Manned Orbital Laboratory. In September 1963, NASA and the Department of Defense agreed to cooperate in building a space station. The DoD wanted its own manned facility and proposed the MOL for photo reconnaissance using large telescopes directed by a 2-man crew. The station was the same diameter as the Titan II upper stage, and it would be launched with a crew riding atop a modified Gemini capsule with a hatch cut into the heat shield on the bottom of the capsule. A test of the MOL, Flight Test OPS 0855, launched on November 3, 1966 on a Titan III-C9 from Cape Canaveral Launch Complex 40. The flight consisted of an MOL mock-up built from a Titan II propellant tank, and a refurbished capsule from the Gemini 2 mission as a prototype Gemini B spacecraft. After the Gemini B prototype separated for a suborbital re-entry, the MOL mock-up continued into orbit and released 3 satellites. A hatch installed in Gemini's heat shield, intended to provide access to the MOL during manned operations, was tested during the capsule's re-entry, and it worked. And the Gemini capsule was recovered near Ascension Island in the South Atlantic by the USS La Salle after a flight of 33 minutes. The program was cancelled just a month before the Apollo 11 moon landing, with the first projected flight still 3 years out. After the moon missions were cancelled, NASA shed hundreds of thousands of employees. Von Braun, head of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center during the 1960s, began arguing for a smaller station than his previous ideas to provide workers with work beyond developing the Saturn rockets. NASA set up the Apollo Logistics Support System Office, originally intended to study various ways to modify Apollo hardware for scientific missions. The office initially proposed a number of projects for direct scientific study, including an extended stay lunar mission which required 2 Saturn V launchers, a lunar truck based on the lunar module design, and a large manned solar telescope using a LEM as its crew quarters. Also, it studied small space stations using a variety of LAM or command service module based hardware. Although it didn't look at the space station specifically, over the next 2 years the office would become increasingly dedicated to this role, and in August of 1965 the office was renamed, becoming the Apollo Applications Program. On August 8, 1969, the McDonnell Douglas Corporation received a contract for the conversion of 2 existing S-4B stages to the Orbital Workshop configuration. One of the S-4 test stages was shipped to McDonnell Douglas for the construction of a mock-up in January 1970. The Orbital Workshop was renamed Skylab in February. The mission computer used aboard Skylab was the IBM System 4PI TC-1, a relative of the AP-101 space shuttle computer. A Saturn V originally produced for the Apollo program, before the cancellation of Apollo 18, 19, and 20, was repurposed and redesigned to launch Skylab. The Saturn V's upper stage was removed, but the controlling instrument unit remained in its standard position. In September of 1972, Skylab was mated with the Saturn V. In early October, tests were conducted on the deployment of the micrometeoroid shield which, after launch, would deploy 13 centimeters above the station. Several problems occurred and bulges existed when it was put into launch configuration. The team scanned the shield with an ultrasonic device and found that 62% of the surface was touching the workshop. The workshop was then pressurized, and the contact areas again were mapped, and 95% of the 2 surfaces were in contact. Since the pressure differential between the workshop and the shield would be substantially higher during flight, the Huntsville team accepted the rigging that the team had done. Skylab was rolled out to the pad on April 16, 1973, and waited for just under a month before it was lifted aloft on May 14th by the modified Saturn V. The launch is sometimes referred to as Skylab 1, or otherwise just SL1.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And we have a liftoff. The Skylab lifting off the pad now, moving up. Houston, 18 seconds, pitch and roll program started. Saturn now maneuvering to its proper flight path attitude. Mark, 25 seconds. 3 seconds. 35 seconds, 1 nautical mile in altitude, looking good. Range safety, give Saturn a green, we've cleared the beach.
63 seconds into the Saturn V's ascent, when it was obscured from tracking cameras by a thick cloud, the micrometeoroid shield prematurely deployed, standing out a few centimeters from the hull of the workshop and was very quickly ripped off, like the skin of a banana, in the hypersonic airflow. At this time, noted a report published in July of 1973, vehicle dynamic measurements such as vibration, acceleration, attitude error, and acoustics indicated strong disturbances. Measurements which are normally relatively static at the time, such as torsion rod strain gauges, tension strap brake wires, temperatures, and solar array position indicators, indicated a loss of the shield. As a result of this failure, others followed. Separation of the micrometeoroid shield caused part of it to wrap around the number 2 solar array and break the latches on the number 1 array. 10 minutes into flight, as planned, the second stage of the Saturn separated, firing its retro rockets to withdraw from the payload, and the plumes of those retro rockets quickly impinged on the number 1 array, breaking its hinge and totally shearing it off. Telemetry from this point showed a sudden loss of temperature readings and inexplicable voltage dropouts, which the board took as indicators that the array had physically separated from the workshop. The effect of the retro-rocket plume impingement was observed almost immediately on the number 2 array temperature and on vehicle body rates. Under normal circumstances, the 2 arrays would have been freed from their attachments by a small explosive charge, and spring-loaded hinges would have automatically unfurled them. Unfortunately, the number 1 array was gone, and its companion was so clogged with debris as to be effectively pinned to the side of the workshop and could only partially open. Still, the station was placed in a 434 by 441 kilometer orbit, inclined at 50 degrees relative to the equator. Immediately following Skylab's launch, Pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center was deactivated and construction proceeded to modify it for the Space Shuttle program, originally targeting a maiden launch in March of 1979. SL-1 was the last unmanned launch from LC-39A until February 19, 2017, when SpaceX Commercial Resupply Mission 10 was launched from there. The manned missions of Skylab would occur using a Saturn 1B rocket from Launch Pad 39B. The Skylab 1, or SL-2, Saturn 1B, was on a launch pad 3 kilometers away and had been readied for launch the day after the station launched. But their mission changed due to the damage the station received during launch, so they prepared for an on-orbit repair mission.